Now in this session, we move into Chapter 5 of Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart by Nicholas Carr. Chapter 5 is titled Antipathies. Environmental Spoiling. In 1976, the social psychologist Ebby Ebbison and two of his colleagues at the University of California at San Diego conducted a study of the residents of a large condominium complex in Irvine, south of Los Angeles. They wanted to find out how physical proximity influences the way people feel about each other. They interviewed some 200 residents, asking about their interactions and relationships with their neighbors. Whom did they talk to? Whom did they avoid? Whom did they like? Whom didn't they? The nearer people lived to each other, the researchers found, the more likely they were to be friends. The odds were far higher that a person would bond with a next-door neighbor than with someone 100 yards down the street. That finding was no surprise. Not only was it commonsensical, it was consistent with a well-established psychological principle called the proximity effect. But the researchers also discovered that living close together often had the opposite result. It aroused not fondness, but enmity. While neighbors were much more likely to be friends, they were also much more likely to be enemies. In fact, and this was a surprise, proximity seemed to breed animosity more often than it did affection. Proximity appeared to be even more important in disliking than in liking, the researchers reported in a 1976 article in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. More disliked than liked individuals lived close to the subjects. Among close neighbors, enemies outnumbered friends. The reason neighbors often become friends, previous research had shown, is simple. They run into each other a lot. They have frequent opportunities to meet and chat, and through such casual conversations they develop a familiarity that spawns mutual empathy, and the empathy fosters a sense of attachment. Neighbors become enemies, the condo researchers discovered, for a very different reason: environmental spoiling. The closer you live to another person, the more exposed you are to his habits and opinions. If you find those habits and opinions irritating, he doesn't bring in his garbage cans, say, or he doesn't clean up after his dog, or he puts up political signs supporting candidates you loathe, you'll resent him for degrading your surroundings. And because his proximity guarantees his irritating habits and opinions remain always in view, your resentment and your antipathy will fester. Because of that antipathy, moreover, you'll take pains to avoid running into him when you're out and about. So the casual contacts that promote empathy and fondness never happen. Enmity, once provoked, becomes self-reinforcing. It's difficult to imagine the condo study being conducted today. Concepts of distance and space, once rooted in the material world, have grown hazy, particularly when it comes to interpersonal relations. Thanks to the net, the link between social proximity and physical proximity has been severed. It's as easy to socialize through a computer or phone screen with someone 1,000 miles away as it is to socialize in person with someone next door. I would say it's easier. Okay. And he goes on to say, it's easier, in fact, as the screen, unlike the neighbor, is always at hand. But the study's findings are, if anything, more illuminating than ever. They help explain why social media's effects have been so different from what we expected, why the technology of connection has produced more strife than harmony. Now that we're all virtual neighbors, we're all in one another's business all the time. We're exposed routinely to the opinions and habits of far more people, both acquaintances and strangers, than ever before. With an almost microscopic view of what everybody else is saying and doing, the screen turns us all into peeping toms. We have no end of opportunities to take offense. There may not be any garbage cans or dog turds in the virtual world, but there's plenty of environmental spoiling. The difference engine. We humans are nothing if not optimistic when it comes to our social relationships. When we meet new people or even anticipate meeting them, we have an inclination to like them, and we sense that our fondness for them will grow as we learn more about them. We see communication on a personal level the same way we see it on a societal level, as a reliable way to form and strengthen bonds. We've all experienced the many ways interpersonal communication can go awry. The casual conversation that turns into a quarrel, the innocent word that gets taken the wrong way, the careless remark that poisons a friendship. But we discount them as anomalies. We don't let them shake our belief that the more information two people exchange, the more they'll understand each other, and the closer they'll become. Like Zuckerberg, we trust that people sharing more leads to people getting along better. It isn't hard to understand where the optimism comes from. We hang out with the people we like the best, our close friends, our work buddies, our romantic partners, and those are also the people we know the most about. Our intuition tells us that having more information about another person must be tied to liking that person. But our intuition is skewed. Whenever we decide we don't like someone, that neighbor with the dog, for instance, we start to avoid them, and so gather less information about them. But when we strike up a friendship with someone, we spend more time with them and learn more about them. As we prune our acquaintances in this way, we end up surrounded by a small and unrepresentative set of people whom we both like a lot and know a lot about. Our personal experience distorts our understanding. Knowing and liking may be strongly correlated within groups of established friends, but that tells us nothing about how people in general react to learning more about others. In 2007, a group of Boston area social psychologists, led by Harvard's Michael Norton, ran a series of experiments to discover what really happens when we receive more information about others. The researchers first conducted surveys to get a baseline reading on people's attitudes. They found, as expected, that the vast majority of people, between 80 and 90%, believe that the more they get to know about another person, the more they'll like that person. Then they tested that assumption. In two experiments, one involving college students and the other involving visitors to an online dating site, some 400 subjects were given descriptions of a fictional person. The descriptions took the form of sets of character traits, randomly chosen and varying in number from 1 to 10. The participants were asked to rate how much they thought they would like the person described by the traits. The results were striking. As the number of personality traits given to participants increased, their liking for the individual described decreased. More information consistently led to less liking. The study revealed, the researchers reported in an article in the American Psychological Association's Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, quote, that the relationship between knowledge and liking within individuals is in fact negative, that more information about any one person leads on average to less liking for that person, end quote. The melancholy upshot: although people believe that knowing leads to liking, knowing more means liking less. Norton and his colleagues conducted additional experiments to figure out why that's so. The explanation they found lies in dissimilarity cascades. It has long been known that perceptions of similarity play a decisive role in determining whom we like and whom we don't. We have a bias to like people that seem similar to us and dislike those who seem different. What the experiments revealed is that the tendency toward disliking is even stronger than the tendency toward liking. As soon as the study participants were exposed to a character trait indicating that a person was unlike them in some way, they began to place more emphasis on evidence of dissimilarity than on evidence of similarity. Differences became more salient and commonalities less salient as the amount of personal information grew. Encountering one instance of dissimilarity causes subsequent information to be interpreted as further evidence of dissimilarity, the researchers explained. The negative relationship between information and liking is caused by the fact that dissimilarity cascades as the amount of information increases. The study suggested something no one had suspected, that a communication network might serve as a vector of enmity even more than of friendship. The research was controversial. The results seemed to contradict other psychological experiments, including studies of the proximity effect, which indicated that familiarity promotes affection. An academic spat broke out in the pages of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. One prominent group of critics, while accepting the validity of the Norton team's findings, argued that the research was too narrow. It failed to account for the many different ways that people can socialize. They pointed in particular to research indicating that brief conversations between strangers tend to produce feelings of affection. In a response to the criticism, Norton and his colleagues acknowledged that their study was not comprehensive and that the connection between interaction and affection or aversion will vary depending on the situation. When two strangers chat, for example, they may indeed sense a liking for each other, but that could be because people are in general wary of disclosing a lot of personal information to someone they've just met. If no evidence of dissimilarity is divulged in a short conversation, strangers may continue to be influenced by their inclination to like new acquaintances. The dissimilarity cascade never starts rolling. That also helps explain why casual, neighborly interactions produce the proximity effect. If you have regular friendly chats about the weather or the local sports team with a guy who lives nearby, your empathy for him will tend to grow, and you may well end up liking him a bit more. If he starts getting too personal, telling you about his political theories or bragging about how much money he has or detailing his sex life, your reaction might be very different. The more you're told, the more likely it is you'll hear something that offends or repels you. Self-disclosure gets riskier as it goes deeper. Always on display. The Norton Group pointed out that trait-based experiments, like the ones they conducted, do a good job of replicating how we actually learn about people today. Rarely do we form impressions of others simply by chatting with them on a sidewalk or a stoop. We gather discrete bits of information about them from many sources through our phones and computers. We Google them. We look at their social media profiles. We scan their posts and comments. We glance at their selfies and other photos. We check out their follower lists and their likes and shares. We parse their texts and other messages. Digital data gathering is how we size up strangers and new acquaintances, and it's how we keep tabs on people we already know, including long-standing friends. We've gotten used to interpreting people as assemblages of traits, as patterns of data. Our information gathering is usually productive. Studies dating back to the early days of instant messaging and texting show that strangers tend to disclose much more information about themselves when chatting through computers than when talking in person, a result of what psychologists call the online disinhibition effect. The old taboo that checked our urge to talk about ourselves in public faded away when we found ourselves looking into a screen instead of another person's eyes. With the rise of social media, oversharing became the new norm. Facebook, Snapchat, X, and other platforms have been painstakingly designed to encourage self-expression. By emphasizing quantitative measures of social status, follower and friend counts, like and retweet tallies, the platforms reward people for broadcasting endless details about their lives and opinions through messages, posts, photos, and videos. In the physical world, we remain present even when we're quiet. In the virtual world, we don't. To shut up even briefly is to disappear. To confirm our existence, we have to keep posting. We have to keep repeating, "Here I am." As all this personal information swirls around the net, people find a lot of evidence of what they have in common with others and a lot of evidence of what they don't. They see likenesses and they see differences. And over time, as the Norton research suggests, they begin to place more weight on the differences. It's hard to imagine a communication mechanism more perfectly geared to the initiation and propagation of dissimilarity cascades than social media. The information that circulates through a social network can act as an attractant. More often, it's a repellent. That most gloomy of sayings is true. Familiarity breeds contempt. It also breeds envy and rivalry. Just as social media's stimulation of self-disclosure triggers our instinct to dislike those we see as different from ourselves, it gives us ever more opportunity and ever greater cause to be envious of others and covetous of what they possess or represent. As with affection and enmity, envy is closely tied to feelings of proximity. We're much more likely to envy someone close to us, literally nearby in space, or figuratively having a similar background or social status, than someone distant from us. When there is no proximity, comparison is less likely to arise, and the subject is less prone to feel inferior, explains Aaron Ben-Ziev, an Israeli philosophy professor and a pioneer in the study of human emotions. Quote, when some proximity does exist, the element of the attainable becomes more dominant, and the probability of envy arising increases, as does the intensity of that envy, end quote. You might well envy a coworker who has a newer or more expensive car than you, but you're unlikely to envy a pop star who drives a Bentley. At least that's how it worked in the past. Envy was circumscribed by location and class. Then, a century ago, mass media began extending the range of human envy by providing individuals with a close-up view of the lives of an ever greater number and variety of other people. Radio, and particularly television, gave listeners and viewers a sense of intimacy with people they previously would have considered too distant, physically or socially, to pay much attention to. Still, mass media imposed its own social boundary. Not everyone, after all, could appear on radio or TV. Social media has now erased even that line. By allowing everyone to display themselves on the same screen, using the same forms of communication, it has gone much further than mass media ever did in eradicating the sense of distance that once limited feelings of envy. As the political scientist and author Alexandra Samuel has written, social media, quote, makes a wider range of outcomes, goods, and experiences feel like they're within our reach. We have at least the illusion of intimacy with a much wider range of people, so we're able to imagine not just what our lives would look like if they were 15% better, but what it would look like to have the wealth of a Kardashian, the influence of Elon Musk, and the talent of Rihanna, end quote. By turning us all into media personalities, social media has also turned us all into rivals. Envy has its uses. For individuals, it can be a spur to ambition, achievement, and creativity. For society as a whole, it can play a role in raising awareness of inequities. The passion that has given driving force to democratic theories is undoubtedly the passion of envy, wrote Bertrand Russell in The Conquest of Happiness. But envy is fundamentally a destructive emotion, personally and socially. As Russell went on to observe, of all the characteristics of ordinary human nature, envy is the most unfortunate. Not only does the envious person wish to inflict misfortune and do so whenever he can with impunity, but he is also himself rendered unhappy by envy. Instead of deriving pleasure from what he has, he derives pain from what others have. Even as envy makes us less content with our own lives, it breeds, and that was a quote there from Russell. Even as envy makes us less content with our own lives, it breeds resentment and animosity toward others. It makes differences stand out all the more sharply. Thanks to social media, writes Samuel, we're actually well on our way to dismantling all the social norms and structures that used to mitigate the risks envy posed to both personal and social well-being. If conversing online engendered empathy the way talking in person does, the negative effects of the explosion of self-disclosure would be ameliorated, at least to some degree. Through all those exchanges of messages, all those posts and replies, all those likes and hearts and fire emojis, we would bit by bit gain a greater appreciation of the feelings and perspectives of others. But talking through computers is not the same as talking in person. When we speak through screens, we don't experience the subtle physical cues, the gestures, the expressions, the glances, that often provide a clearer window onto the inner lives of others than do words alone. Nor do we give others the attention that we do when they're standing or sitting beside us. Indeed, the presence of a phone distances us even from those sitting right next to us. Sherry Turkle, an MIT social psychologist who has been studying how people communicate through computers for decades, has described social media as an anti-empathy machine. She argues that we suppress our capacity for empathy by putting ourselves in environments where we're not looking at each other in the eye, not sticking with the other person long enough or hard enough to follow what they're feeling. End quote. Over the long run, she says, a dependency on online communication can reduce people's ability to feel empathy in general, making them less empathetic even when they're not on their phone or computers. Even their self-awareness can be blunted. Research shows, quote, research shows that those who use social media the most have difficulty reading human emotions, including their own, end quote. Empathy is what neuroscientists call a complex emotion. It requires, as Helen Rice, a psychiatry professor at Harvard Medical School, puts it, an exquisite interplay of brain networks. Unlike basic emotions such as anger and disgust, which arise almost instantaneously in response to stimuli, complex emotions take time to emerge in the mind. Like complex thoughts, they require attentiveness, a steady rather than a darting eye. Although we're quick to assume a direct correlation between communication and empathy, the more information we exchange, the more empathy we'll feel. Empathy depends far more on the quality of our communication than its volume. It's another thing we sacrifice when we talk too much. Sword and shield. In the 1960s, Dalmas Taylor and Erwin Altman, two young psychology researchers at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, began a study of how relationships develop between people working in tight quarters under stressful conditions, in a submarine, say, or on the deck of a destroyer. They quickly discovered that surprisingly little research had been done on how relationships deepen or fall apart as time passes. There were lots of narrowly focused studies of different facets of human interaction, but few attempts to develop an overarching model of how bonds strengthen or weaken. Through years of experiments, surveys, and fieldwork, the two developed such a model, which they came to call the social penetration theory. They laid out its details in Social Penetration, the Development of Interpersonal Relationships, a highly influential 1973 book that is still considered a central text in social psychology. Relationship building, as Taylor and Altman describe it, is a slow and delicate process, contingent on the pace, content, and reciprocity of communication. It proceeds through 4 stages. In the first, orientation, new acquaintances discuss fairly trivial matters, revealing only superficial information about themselves, the music they listen to, for instance, or their favorite movies. Wary of creating conflict when forming initial impressions, they speak cautiously and remain circumspect. If some affinity is established, they move on to the second stage, exploratory affective exchange. Now they talk more freely, letting more of their personality show, and they discuss more sensitive subjects, like their political views or their health. Still, they avoid revealing details about their inner lives, continuing to restrict their disclosures to what Taylor and Altman term public areas. In the third stage of the penetration process, affective exchange, true friendships are established. The conversation shifts from exploration to revelation. The previously hidden private self comes into view as the friends discuss intimate aspects of their upbringing, their emotions, and their beliefs. As they open up to each other, the tone of the conversation becomes more spontaneous and animated, less self-conscious, if not altogether unguarded. In the final and most intimate stage, stable exchange, conversations flow easily without restraint or restriction. Mutual trust is established, allowing the most private personal information to be shared, including information that is a source of shame or sadness. The bond is implicit. For most people, few relationships reach this point. Stable exchange is reserved for lovers and the closest of friends and family members. In their book, Taylor and Altman used the familiar trope of peeling an onion to explain their theory. As relationships progress, more layers of the self are peeled away. Exchanges of information grow steadily broader as conversations extend to more and increasingly sensitive topics, and steadily deeper as more private feelings and experiences are explored. The exchanges, the authors stress, consist of more than words. Gestures, expressions, and touches also matter, as do the way people orient themselves in the space they share, and when they're apart, think or fantasize about each other. The process is fragile. At any stage, conflicts can arise. One person may reveal something that repels the other. The tone of the conversation may turn abrasive or desultory, or self-disclosure may become unbalanced, with one partner revealing intimate details of a sort the other withholds. Under such stresses, the relationship may revert to an earlier phase. Close friends become casual acquaintances, maybe, or come to an acrimonious end. Communication becomes constrained or breaks down. The layers, to push the metaphor too far, go back on the onion. Soon after the book's publication, Taylor shifted into the field of university administration, where he would go on to have a distinguished career. Altman continued his psychological research, and he kept circling back around the book's argument. He sensed that something was missing, that he and Taylor had told only part of the story. The social penetration theory explained how people form bonds by gradually opening themselves up to others. What it didn't address was people's conflicting desire to shield themselves from social penetration, to establish boundaries that limit communication and disclosure. Revealing oneself to others may bring social rewards, Altman realized, but it exacts a psychic cost. There is always a tension in relationships between openness and closedness. As much as we might want the tension to resolve itself into a state of serene equilibrium, it never does. People are always at once open and closed toward one another. There is no indication that in choosing the word penetration to describe their original theory of relationship building, Taylor and Altman gave much thought to the word's many, sometimes ugly connotations. But those connotations haunt Altman's subsequent research. They help explain why we fear self-disclosure, even as we embrace it as a necessary and often invigorating means of being part of society. Penetration may literally or figuratively be an act of love, entailing a physical or psychological merging of selves, but it is also always an act of violation. It exposes the self to another or to many others. The fear isn't that we will reveal and hence lose the essence of our soul. Very few of us, no matter how hard we peer inside ourselves, ever come across a kernel of selfhood. The fear is the opposite, that we will be reduced to a kernel. In allowing ourselves to be pinned down, we will sacrifice the self's flexibility and freedom. It's the same fear that lies behind many people's aversion to being photographed. A photograph condenses you into a single image, turns you into a pattern of information. In fixing you as an object in the minds of others, it robs you of complexity and agency. In a photo, you can't explain yourself. You're rendered mute. In the mid-1970s, Altman published several articles laying out a privacy regulation theory that he offered as a complement and counterweight to the social penetration theory. Healthy human relations, whether at the personal or the social level, require communication, he argued, but they also require boundary systems that curb the flow and intensity of communication. We need communication, and we need protection from communication. The reasons go beyond matters of personal integrity and agency. Without limits, excessive communication triggers defensive, antisocial reactions on the part of individuals and groups. Extensive self-disclosure might seem benign or even laudable as a social goal, he explained, but it's dangerous. It can end up undermining the very cohesiveness that we desire communication to provide. Quote, extreme openness might actually increase the probability of conflict, violate self-integrity, and detract from the mutuality that was being sought in human relationships, end quote. Communication technologies are tools of social penetration. We use them to reveal ourselves and to probe the selves of others. But by blurring conversation and broadcasting, social media takes social penetration to an extreme. It gives people enormous incentives to talk about themselves before a mass media-sized audience, and few incentives to secure their privacy or respect the privacy of others. It's all sword, no shield. The technology's bias is evident in the language that surrounds it. The internet has from the start been celebrated as a model of and a force for openness in technology, in communication, in society. An open network built on open standards and open to all, the net is, we are regularly reminded, the enemy of everything closed and secret. The rhetoric is rousing, but it should give us pause. A decent society, as Altman implied, will safeguard personal privacy at least as vigorously as it promotes self-expression. In social relations as in personal relationships, transparency needs to be tempered by opacity. When a society pushes everyone toward self-exposure, when it tears down all boundaries, it sets the stage not for harmony, but for discord. The crowd. In 1903, the German sociologist George Simmel gave a lecture called The Metropolis and Mental Life on the psychic consequences of urban living. However exciting and energizing it may at times be, the experience of being crowded together with others in the extensive communicative life of a city, Simmel argued, produces in people an unsettling sense of mutual strangeness and repulsion. It also triggers a more general fear, chronic in modern life, of being swallowed up in the social technological mechanism. The feelings of unease usually remain hidden, suppressed behind an outward defensive countenance of indifference or good cheer, but they can at any moment break out into hatred and conflict. Simmel's sense of city life may have been overly bleak, but his assessment of crowding and his toll on mental health has been confirmed by many studies, including Altman's. When we feel impinged upon by large numbers of other people and overwhelmed by a profusion of sensory stimuli, we experience a kind of social claustrophobia, with symptoms of stress, depression, withdrawal, and at worst, aggression. There are no bodies online, but there are myriad presences. With everyone pressing their virtual flesh on everyone else all the time, the communicative life becomes more extensive and more oppressive than it is in even the most densely populated of cities. Simmel's description of the psychological conditions of the metropolis, the rapid telescoping of changing images, pronounced differences within what is grasped at a single glance, and the unexpectedness of violent stimuli, seems, if anything, more accurate as a description of the social media environment than the urban one. In online society, moreover, the tempering influence of face-to-face conversation is missing. There are no sidewalks or stoops. Virtual presence entails physical absence. That's not to discount the many close bonds people have formed online. Facebook posts have kindled or rekindled friendships. Snaps have spawned romances. Exchanges of tweets have opened up into deep conversations. TikToks have inspired feelings of communal joy, often expressed in dancing and singing. Many people who feel isolated or uncomfortable in their physical surroundings have found companionship and a sense of belonging in the Internet's vast, disembodied social scene. Just as text speak has room for wit and repartee, social media has room for affection and care. But social media's benefits, as real and welcome as they are, shouldn't blind us to the deeper ways that digital technology is changing social dynamics. The discoveries that psychologists and sociologists have made about the fraught nature of human relationships, about environmental spoiling and dissimilarity cascades, about the slow and fragile unfolding of relationships, about the tension between disclosure and privacy, reveal how ill-suited the human psyche is to our new media environment. As connections multiply and messages proliferate, relationships get stretched thin. Mistrust spreads. Antipathies mount. That's the tragedy of communication. When there's too much of it, a reversal takes place. It begins to undermine the very social and personal qualities we look to it to foster. To put it in the language of economics, communication displays diminishing returns to scale, and eventually the returns. Let's see, let me say this again. To put it in the language of economics, communication displays diminishing returns to scale, and eventually the returns turn negative. Communication subverts itself. That's what Harold Innis was getting at when, in his 1947 lecture, he suggested that more communication means less understanding. Adam Joinson, a psychology professor at the University of Bath in England, coined the term digital crowding to describe the excessive self-disclosure and social contact that characterizes social media's teeming but ghostly metropolis. The anxiety and innervation such crowding produces makes the Internet's antisocial tendencies all the more pronounced. With the advent of social media, Johnson and a group of his colleagues wrote in the book Privacy Online, it is inevitable that we will end up knowing more about people and also more likely that we end up disliking them because of it. Ian Bogost, a computer science and media studies professor at Washington University in St. Louis, is blunter. Social media, he wrote in a 2022 Atlantic essay, plunges us into a sociopathic rendition of human sociality. This ends chapter 5. In our next session, we will move into chapter 6, which is titled The Democratization Fallacy. So we'll continue in the next session with Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart by Nicholas Carr. Thank you for watching.